have to really add in all foods because most people will say, "Oh, well, I don't like those foods," but you don't even know what you like at that point. I mean, I literally convinced myself I didn't like anything that wasn't quote unquote healthy.
Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm Jonathan and I'm here to help you end 24/7 food thoughts, binge eating, and actually enjoy life with food. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only, not to be substituted for medical or personalized advice. Check the link in the description for my recovery resources and let's get straight to the episode. And in this episode, we're here to introduce Mallory Page. She's a dietitian and I've been following her for a while, since her YouTube days. And even when I was a student, I got lots of advice on how to manage little things like managing my folders, how to see patients. And now she's supporting people. Actually, I'll let you do the introductions. Who are you, Mallory?
Yeah, I am a dietitian. I call myself a food freedom dietitian, although that is in no way a technical term, because I think that our perception of dietitians can be a whole wide range of things. So I always like to share that I'm more focused on the disordered eating, healing your relationship with food side. So very different than back to my YouTube days and my internship when I was in my clinical rotation, but now I work for myself in a private practice. So that's the population that I focus on. And although I'm based in Austin, Texas, I work virtually. So with people all over the world, which is very, very fun to be able to see people from all different walks of life and in spaces of their life as well.
Yeah. And from your RD days, registered dietitian days, for those who don't are not familiar with it, how different do you think it is working in a hospital to as a food freedom dietitian?
They're really night and day different, although the experiences that I got as a clinical intern, as a dietitian, were so valuable in so many different ways. When I did my internship, I was in a state called Oklahoma and I was visiting a town in Shawnee. So, if you guys are familiar with the 2020 craze of Tiger King, it was only about an hour away from Tiger King. So to give you an idea of the type of population, like that is real. And I had people coming in like that that either didn't have a car, they never had access to education before. They would be, some people were 2 hours from a grocery store, gas station. I mean, the things that I saw were so eye opening, even though I had had experiences in my past that showed me different people from different walks of life and income levels. That was a really valuable experience. And it also taught me about seeing clinical cases in real life because we learn about it all in school and what we should do, but it's different when you get to apply it in practice. So, although I don't practice like that now, and working as a private practice dietitian is completely different in the sense that I work from home. I work from my computer most of the time. I see clients that are coming to me and investing in my services and are also typically coming to me for totally different purposes. Although we did get some people in the hospital that were more eating disorder based, they are both very interesting and in their own ways fun experiences to have as a job.
Yeah. Did you ever get going back to the Tiger King thing? Did you ever get to meet the Tiger King?
No, I did not. I cannot imagine what that would have been like, but they never came in there. I don't even know. That could have been the closest hospital for them because these things are in the middle of nowhere. I mean,
Yeah.
seriously, from that hospital that I was at, it was, I think, like 45 minutes to the next available hospital in that area. So it was so isolated and it made for a completely different dynamic than other hospital settings.
Yeah. Imagine him hopefully not ending up in a hospital and then you're the dietitian for
I wouldn't even know what to think. We did have some people that were quite eccentric. I will say that though.
both. Oh, that's amazing. And so, becoming a food freedom dietitian, what was that transition to from being, um, well, a hospital-based dietitian, which most of us, 99% of us dietitians, start off as. to becoming a food freedom dietitian to your private practice, supporting people with, you know, intuitive eating, food freedom?
My journey was all over the place because when I was in my undergrad, I actually had all of my experience in sports nutrition. So I directly shadowed and worked with the football team and all the different teams when I was in at U of A, University of Arizona is where I went. And then I pursued that through different internships, working in places like Exos, which is like kind of a globally known brand for sports nutrition, and all different places. I even did it in my internship, my dietetic internship. So that was what my mindset was on until I actually got into my dietetic internship and recognized that as I had recovered from my own eating disorder and struggles, I felt more passionate working with those that had also struggled with that, and as well as working more face to face with clients. Although you are face to face in sports nutrition, there's a lot of food service. So it's not counseling based in the same way, unless you are in a counseling based sports nutrition practice. Then, of course, it can be. So once I decided that I wasn't as interested in sports nutrition, I went through the other rotations that I had in my dietetic internship, which the last one being my clinical internship. I didn't end up working in that in a full-time role, but I did go from being in that role directly pretty much into my private practice role. Although I did the unconventional route and I was managing a fitness center and doing two jobs at the same time to launch my business. And so getting scrappy with that type of stuff is oftentimes, unless you have the financial resources not to be scrappy, super important. So that was a little bit of my journey into getting to the place that I'm at now. And then once I made that decision to switch, there's so much that goes into the private practice journey and even finding who you really want to work with because it changes as you go.
Yeah, it seems like you had to hustle.
Definitely to an extent. I won't say that I had the most challenging hustle ever, but I do think that there is an element to that in any entrepreneurial journey, especially if you're going to have success because it requires some of that hustle or just drive and desire to be in that position.
Yeah. And going back to your story about like supporting people with like sports nutrition and everything. You mentioned about like you struggling your eating disorder. What eating disorder did you have? If that's not too personal question.
No, I talk about it all the time. So I'm very well versed in speaking on what I struggled with. I started dealing with problems with food when I was around my sophomore year of high school, but I didn't really realize and or I was in denial is what I would say until around my sophomore year of college. And at that time I recognized that I was dealing with orthorexia, which is a very new and not even really accepted in the DSM-5 disorder, which is basically an obsession with health. And people get confused like, how can being obsessed with health become unhealthy? But it's just like anything. If you drink too much water, you can go to the hospital. If you're too focused on health, you can also become very unwell.
Mm.
And along with that, I was struggling with body dysmorphia and over exercising, all of those type of things to go along with it too.
Yeah, and just for people who are listening at the moment, would you kindly explain specifically what the DSM-5 is, what the word body dysmorphia is, and um, orthorexia a bit more?
Yeah, so in its simplistic terms, although I am not the best person to talk about this, the DSM-5 is diagnostic criteria and diagnostic disorders out there that you can actually get diagnosed with. I just said diagnosed like 600 times. But if you go and you are struggling with your mental health and you align with what goes along with anxiety in the DSM-5, they can diagnose you with that. But with something like orthorexia, they don't have that actually accepted into it. So it's not a clinical diagnosis as of this point, at least when I last looked and from what I've last heard, versus something like anorexia or binge eating disorder. Those both are. So it's just something that you can basically actually have as that diagnosis. And then body dysmorphia is struggles where you just don't see your body accurately. That's basically the easiest way that I would say it. You can look in the mirror and see all these things wrong with yourself, and what you may be seeing is not an accurate depiction of you. And that dissonance creates a lot of mental unrest and potentially actions around food, exercise, mental health, anything that can create really problematic, effects in your body and your mind.
Mm. And so, did you think you struggled with orthorexia in your sophomore year? And just for clarification, uh, just for my knowledge, like, is sophomore year the first year, second year?
Oh, yeah, I should always explain. So, basically, in high school, sophomore year, and in college, sophomore year are your second year. So, high school,
Second
2
year.
out of 4, and then college, 2 out of 4 as well. So, it was pretty much a 4-year span until I even recognized that I was struggling with what I was. And it did worsen over time, too. So, it was building over that
Mm,
point of time. And once I recognized that I was struggling with that, it still wasn't a clear cut next step kind of recovery journey like you may see some people have. It was very all over the place. So
And how did you know it was a problem, the orthorexia?
it was just affecting my life to the extent that I had to address it. So at the time of my sophomore year, there were a lot of issues that I was dealing with mental health wise, even physically, that at that point, a little bit physically, not as much, that were coming up. And I would say that it was warning signs. Our body is so smart, it tries to communicate with us and warn us when we're doing something wrong. We often don't listen or we suppress it, which is what I was doing with these actions I was taking around food and exercise. So that was when I first recognized it and why. But I didn't actually really commit to working on it until I hit somewhat of a rock bottom with it later on, where I was forced to address it because there was no other option. Like I was in the place where you kind of had to, which I'd like to say that my journey isn't the one where it is getting to that point, but that's just the reality. And a lot of people have similar experiences. So it's always good to talk openly about them.
Yeah. And with the orthorexia, like, um, did you because you said before it's about this obsession with healthy eating. Some people think it's, oh, you're just so committed. You look at all your willpower. Oh, I wish I could eat like you and everything. Did you ever get like comments from friends or maybe even family about the way you're eating back then?
All the time. Everybody commented on what I ate. And to their credit, of course, I made it very easy to comment because it was my identity. I was an athlete when I was in high school, and I worked out like I was an athlete when I was in college, although I was not. And so much of what I did in both of those times revolved around what I ate. And it was also so disruptive that it often had to be a topic of conversation because it was present in scenarios that other people were around, like in, because of the fact that I couldn't eat this or I could only eat that, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like when you're doing something quite disruptive, whether it be for good or for bad, which in my case this was the bad, people are going to comment on it. And a lot of the time it's because it makes them slightly uncomfortable and they're like, I don't know what to do. But then in my case, it was also that there was a lot of people that looked up to it and thought that I was doing such a good thing and I was so fit and whatever else it may be. And so in their mind, it was complimentary because the way that it presented was, although disruptive in the sense of it making itself known, not disruptive in the way that people were concerned for me. They just thought I was doing something to be healthy. And that was part of the issue as well.
Mm. Oh, that must have been really, really difficult. And so you were like trying to recover whilst having orthorexia, I mean, and these people were just like commenting on your like lack of a better word, eating disorder, if that's not
Mhm.
a proper term.
Yeah.
I guess let's call it an eating disorder. Orthorexia. They're commenting on things about your eating. Was it very difficult for you? Like, because you're trying to chase recovery, but at the same time, you're getting this affirmation like, "Oh, you're doing so well," and everything. Because do you think people could find their identity in the way they eat, their affirmation from orthorexia or something?
I talk with my clients about the identity piece so
Mm,
often because it is one of the biggest challenges and hurdles to people recovering, especially that are in more what I'm going to say, quote unquote, atypical bodies. I don't really like that terminology because if you're familiar with eating disorders in that world, there's anorexia and it's atypical anorexia, and the only differentiator is someone's body size. So it's kind of ridiculous, in my opinion. That's a whole separate conversation. But why I bring that up is because I was in a body that was privileged and also was not one that looked, like, really ill. It just looked pretty normal and pretty fit. And so when I have clients that come to me, because that's most of the clients I work with, they have dealt with these same things of people commenting so positively on these actions that they're taking that they've latched onto that as a sense of worth and identity in a way to feel accepted and even to just have a focus in their life because we want to have things that we're quote unquote good at. And this can feel like something we can be good at. So for me, I didn't even recognize for so long how much of my identity it really was to be this healthy and fit person, especially as someone that's a dietitian and was becoming a dietitian. And the idea of recovering seemed almost counterintuitive to health, even though it wasn't, and also totally the reverse of what I had built my whole identity on.
yeah, that must have been really difficult, and, like, especially, like, everyone has this idea about dietitians, eating chicken, broccoli, or rice, quinoa, stuff like that. And that might have been like, oh, to the point, that could be orthorexic behaviors. But like as a dietitian, if they see you eating foods like cookies, pizzas, even I think it must be even more harder to recover from orthorexia as a dietitian.
I do think that it's harder for dietitians to recover from eating disorders, but especially those that are atypical or something like orthorexia because of exactly what you are saying. And this would be the same for doctors, personal trainers, even in sometimes like therapists, any health based field. I actually work with a ton of people in health based fields because they feel this pressure to present a certain way. And because of all of the weight and body stigma that we deal with in this world. And I have the privilege that I recovered into a body that's still very societally acceptable. There are other people that do not, and it's extremely hard to feel invalidated in their profession because of something that is out of their control and is actually their healthy set point and body. So it's extremely challenging for many professions, but especially dietetics as well.
Mm. And there's several points that I could come from this, but I'll take it one step at a time. But we could probably talk about like recovering from an eating disorder or even disordered eating habits if you're at a much higher body weight, the idea of health at every size. But for now, if hopefully I don't lose that question in my mind, but but like from you struggling with orthorexia, how did you go from struggling with orthorexia, taking over your life, to where you are now?
My journey is definitely a do as I say, not as I do, not because I'm telling you to do what I say, but because what I did was not the right way to go about it at all. As I mentioned earlier, I hit a rock bottom with my mental health and also my physical health. So I was hospitalized for not my eating disorder, but because I was having all of these accumulation of issues. And even at that time, of course, they really didn't find anything. They were just like, "Oh, you must just be really stressed." And so I finally decided then that I would get therapy to help me work through some of the mental health struggles. And I got really lucky that I had a really great therapist. I kind of did a crapshoot because I went to my campus health and I just got matched with a therapist and she happened to be great. But most people do not have that success, honestly. There's oftentimes not a huge amount of counselors even at a university. And then also the number that you may connect with isn't always great, especially because they're not being paid as much. So I didn't have access to a lot of financial help. And that was part of my struggle in getting help too. It wasn't just my mindset. But once I went to that therapist, I feel like over time and some kind of starting to finally get more analytical about what I was doing, I recognized how much my eating disorder was affecting what I was doing. And finally, I decided to start to address that. Now, this is the point in time where I really wish that I would have gone to a dietitian. That was partially not it didn't happen partially because of my own pride and feeling like I should be able to figure it out as a dietitian, or I wasn't a dietitian, a soon to be dietitian at the time, but also partially because of lack of financial resources. And so I just kind of bootstrapped doing it one step at a time. And it took way longer. It was way more painful. It was really just an accumulation of figuring out a bunch of different things that I was doing that were not serving me and trying my best to work through them with the support of people in my life. So it was not the pretty version and it's not the way I would suggest, but it is how it happened.
By the way, just a quick break from the podcast to let you know of my free hunger regulation webinar series, which is in the link in the description of this podcast. There's also an ebook version if you're more of a reader than a watcher. This is the perfect resource I wish I had when I struggled with binge eating years ago, which is used to guide you from everything you need to know, from why we binge, what are the binge triggers, and the eating pattern to stop binge eating. Because when we've been struggling with binge eating for so long, you and your body lose touch of what normal hunger and normal fullness is. You're constantly on feast or famine mode. So head to the link in the description of this podcast for the free hunger regulation resources to have a clear game plan to tackle binge eating for good. Anyway, let's get straight back to the episode. Well, I'm really glad to where you are now. Like, what physical steps, practical steps did you do? Like, did you have to introduce certain foods, or what's the recovery process for orthorexia, or at least the one you tried?
Yeah, so many different things depending on the person. I feel like a important part of it is definitely diversifying your foods. That is something that's so key with orthorexia, and you have to really add in all foods because most people will say, "Oh, well, I don't like those foods," but you don't even know what you like at that point. I mean, I literally convinced myself I didn't like anything that wasn't quote unquote healthy. So that's a huge part of the process. Also, taking break from exercise is huge. That was also really challenging for me. And a lot of people will try to push against it or try to quote unquote recover with exercise, but you really do need to take a break, especially if that's a part of what you're dealing with. And then there was a little bit of amounts for me, but not as much. That's just different per person. So those are some of the more practical things that you have to do in terms of like physical steps. But then there's also a lot of the mental work that you have to do, addressing why you're using food and exercise as a coping mechanism, understanding what it is that these things are providing to you, and how for me, it was a lot of coping with my past traumas. It was trying to bring myself a sense of being enough through trying to be perfect, quote unquote, at everything. There were so many things that intersected with it that are a little bit less tangible, but still equally as important as the physical steps too.
Hmm. Like, suppose I was like struggling with orthorexia right now. Like, what would you suggest to me? Like, let's say I was struggling with like perfectionist um traits. Like, for example, I couldn't control this in my life, so I'm gonna control my diet, orthorexia. What would you suggest or say to me?
Well, in my ideal scenario, someone in that position would get help from both a dietitian and a therapist, and then also potentially a psychiatrist too, because who knows what could be contributing to your perfectionistic tendencies. I mean, there could be OCD, you could have anxiety and depression, you could have autism. I mean, literally, there are so many different other factors that can contribute, and it can be really challenging for people that don't know that they have another type of diagnosis, and the things we're trying to do aren't always working because we don't have that piece yet. I mean, they're not working at all, but you can still feel really stuck. So that would be my ideal scenario, is having that whole team together. Now, is that always realistic? Unfortunately, no, because not everybody can do that. So I think that my realistic steps for anyone, if they don't have the funds to work with people, would be to take a survey of your habits and try to be as objective as possible, or bring on someone in your life that can help you to be objective and think about when something brings you distress. So, for example, you were talking about like chicken, broccoli, and rice earlier. That doesn't have to be an orthorexic meal, but if you feel like you eat something that's not chicken, broccoli, or rice, or something that doesn't fit your quote unquote rules, and you get distressed, that's a sign that it's not healthy for you. So, writing down all of those things, taking a survey of them, and then piece by piece trying to implement goals that are realistic and tangible to take those rules down one step at a time. And also at the same time, ideally be working on the mental side and replacing that stuff with other coping mechanism, mental tools, all of that type of stuff. So I know that sounds very overwhelming, which is why it can be helpful to do it with someone that can walk you through it. But that is the process that you would go through in order to heal. It's not so fancy, it's just challenging and can be long and arduous.
Hmm. And like even with like psychology and counseling skills, like there's something to be said about like journaling. I think I just read it somewhere. I think it's
Mhm,
from this YouTuber I listen and watch to. His name is Ali Abdal. He's a doctor, if you're familiar with him.
mhm.
So he interviewed this woman, um, and she's a neuroscientist, and she said that something as simple as journaling, it solidifies your thoughts. It actually connects some neurons in your brain. Just journaling, even as gratitude journaling or journaling what you've eaten, it's really like reconnecting your thoughts and like making you realize self-reflection. Oh, that's a bit strange because sometimes when we do it, then it seems a bit like automatic, like we don't really think much about it. But when we actually write it down, we see it on paper. Strangely, we think, no, that's actually really strange. That's actually a bit disordered when you look at the bigger picture. So
Yeah. Neural pathways and what you're talking about with even changing those through actions of something like journaling is really the more scientific version of what we're doing that
yeah,
can feel very overwhelming. Andrew Huberman, who is
yeah,
an incredibly smart like scientist, he speaks about the eating disorder and the scientific presentation of specifically anorexia. So it is a little bit more nuanced to that on his podcast. And he references a study where they discuss the fact that people that are anorexic, which I would argue that this probably extends to other types of disorders, but study was done on people that were anorexic. Their pleasure pathways and like the stuff that gives them joy are actually completely changed. So they literally get pleasure and joy from restriction, which is why it is that reinforcement loop that they want to keep doing it. And it is completely flipped from the normal person that would eat food and they feel like pleasure, satisfaction, happiness. And that is part of what makes it so difficult. And why people that are eating, they literally feel miserable. It's like if we feel starving and feel miserable, they feel starving and feel happy. And so to put that into the bigger picture of why this is so hard is really helpful, because you're not just fighting against your own like kind of habits. You're also fighting against your mind that has developed to feed into this type of disorder.
oh, that's really interesting because because you would see things like on social media. There's even this YouTuber back then. I don't really like catch up with her, but back then she really blew up because of her weight. Eugenia Cooney, I think her name is pronounced.
Yeah, I feel like I know who you're talking about, but I'm not super familiar, but I know the name.
Yeah, and people were just saying like, "Oh, you look so skinny. You look like you look like a pair of sticks or something." And then they were saying like, "Oh, why don't you just eat?" Like, although she's like her YouTube channel is nothing related to food. It's just about like get ready with me or like I'm trying like 10 dresses and stuff like that, interviewing this guy and everything. Nothing related to food at all. She's just living her life and people are just saying like, "Just eat, just eat. Oh, you look so ugly," and blah blah blah, stuff like that. And then she had a break on YouTube and everything. And yeah, so it's pretty sad. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I fell down that rabbit hole with her actually. I do know who you're talking about, and she took a break and then she came back, and then I think she relapsed recently. I mean, we're speculating. We don't know, but it people can't really look like that without having an eating disorder typically to her extent. And it was actually wild because I was watching this one thing. As I said, I fell down a full rabbit hole. So,
We all do.
oh,
Like,
right, we all do. But I watched this thing
eventually.
where she like talked about there was a moment where someone commented. I mean, people comment all the time on how small she is, and she doesn't react because in the brain of the anorexic, they love that. I mean, they are literally feeding off of that. You could say they're hideously skinny and they are living for it, right? So their mind is totally in a different space. But then someone commented and said something along the lines of like, "Oh no, you guys should stop saying that. She actually looks a little bit like she's gained some weight," and she was furious. Like, she almost had a mental breakdown. Like, she ended the whole video. And so it really goes to show, like, how much we don't really understand someone in that mindset. I mean, I can't understand someone fully in that mindset because I'm not her, but I also never dealt with that. It's very fascinating to learn how these type of mental illnesses, because it really is a mental illness, manifest physically in that way.
Yeah, and like with the comments, still going back to the comments, like
Yeah.
people commenting, "Wow," like part of the comments, like maybe like 30%, I guess, just saying, we're saying like, "Wow, you look so pretty in that dress. You look so beautiful. Oh, you're thriving and everything." What do you think is the fine line? Like some people are concerned for her health, some people are just bullying her, some people are saying she's really beautiful as she is. What what do you think people should do?
It's really hard to know what to do in those scenarios. So I definitely have empathy for everyone trying to navigate it because it is really sad to see this, whether it be someone on the internet that we see, someone in your life that you're dealing with. And the problem is, there's nothing that you personally can do to change their actions. I wish that weren't the case. And I'm not saying to not do anything. I'll explain what to do, or at least my best advice, but just know that don't fault yourself. You can't fault yourself if you don't change how they react because someone in my denial phase could have told me 1 million times that I had a problem and I wouldn't have cared. I would have believed and told myself that what I was doing was healthy. So, especially in the case of this YouTuber that we're talking about, the best thing that would anyone could do would be to not comment on her appearance at all and then just continually say, like, "I hope you're doing okay," like, "No, we're here to support you." Really just extend support in order to make her know that she's not alone. When it's someone in your life, you obviously have to weigh the age and the scenario. So if someone is younger, like they are still under the age of 18, there are cases where you may want to alert a parent or someone of authority because you can have more say, which is sometimes really useful. Because you can't go up to someone and say, "Hey, I think you have a problem," if they're not ready to hear it, and they may even push you away. So just offering your support, asking someone how they're doing, and recognizing that that's really all you can do unless they're of the age where you think it may be pertinent to interfere. And there are some times, even when someone is, older, that you can kind of try to put something together, but
Mm,
like, we've all seen the shows like Intervention, right? You can only really do so much for someone unless they want that help, although it's really sad, it's just the truth.
yeah. And going back to your well, I'll call it story of
Mhm.
orthorexia. Um, did you have people commenting on your weight and saying like, "Wow, you look so beautiful," and everything, or like maybe bullies or people trying to, lack of a better word, control you, trying to quote unquote fix you?
Yeah, I do think that I had some comments on my food more specifically in high school because people saw my shift. So in high school, they saw me go from eating pizza at lunch and doing normal things to becoming so obsessive that there were some people that were able to notice that and say, I don't think this is normal, or why are you doing this? You have a problem. But as I said, I just completely dismissed that and told myself they're not as disciplined. They don't get it. I mean, you make up a million excuses. And I didn't have as much of a physical change in high school. I feel like the physical change came more in college, although it was not super obvious. And so there weren't any people that were necessarily commenting on a fluctuation, but I do feel like there were people that would comment on how fit, quote unquote, I looked, and that was really challenging for me because of the fact that I feel like I tied a lot of that to who would be attracted to me. Like many men that were attracted to me were more of like the fit and athletic. And I was like, well, I can't lose that. Or there would be girls that I feel like then it made me feel like, well, they think I look good and I want to look like them. So that makes me feel better. It's just a whole like never ending loop of disliking the way that you look constantly and dying for others' validation, and yet also constantly being in the pursuit of looking better, but there's no end goal because you never look good enough for yourself.
Mm, yeah. And so, well, it seems like a really big roller coaster. Food. And if you're like, it's like a spectrum, really, like eating disorder to intuitive eating. Since you're now really focused on like intuitive eating, how different is your life now that you're very focused on intuitive eating compared to like jumping from diet to diet and to control your weight? Did it have any how's it affect how's it affected you physically and mentally?
Yeah, I explained the time when I was in my eating disorder, like being locked in a cage that you created for yourself, and it
Wow.
affects every single area of your life. And not just in the sense of how you may think. I mean, yeah, does it kind of bum you out when everyone's going out for pizza and you don't get to be a part of it? Maybe, but oftentimes you kind of feel like this high off of it, like you're better than everyone. It's sad to admit, but that's the reality of how the brain can work in those stages. But the things that, as you look back, really make you feel just emotion is the way that it affected your relationships to yourself, to others. It makes you very just like self-focused, and it's very hard to notice that on the other side of it. And also how the obsession with those things takes up such a chunk of your brain space that you are not able to fully maximize experiences in school, in work, in life, and you may miss a lot of opportunities. And that was 100% the case for me. It showed up in all of those things, not just in food and exercise. So now my life is so different that it's hard to even put into words because I don't even have to focus on those things. And that's the cool thing about when you're a true intuitive eater, which takes time. I like how you said eating disorder to intuitive eating is like a big spectrum because it really is. They don't coincide at the same time, like even in recovery. So I don't even feel like I have to focus on food. I can just allow it to be a part of my life, and therefore I can put my energy towards relationships, my job, my whatever I want to put it towards instead of always having it be on the same thing. And then my identity becomes so much more, it has so much more depth, and it is so much more fulfilling and lends to so much self confidence overall.
That's amazing. Um, and, like most people talk about like, oh, if I'll only end this diet if I reach this goal, and then I can do whatever one I can eat whatever I want. I'll have so much more freedom. And what do you think about like people? I mean, this goes back from because I remembered I had to like bring up a question earlier about like health at every size and everything. But like, what do you think about living in living in the future? Do you think that's a good goal, or do you think people can start intuitive eating right now, even if they're at a higher body weight?
So there's so many different things that I would ask someone to know what next steps they should take, not based off of their body size, but based off of everything else that is going on in their life. Because I don't know how this was created because the original founders of intuitive eating did not intend for this and they didn't specify this. But there is almost this rhetoric out there that intuitive eating is eating disorder treatment, and it is not. I mean, you
Yeah.
cannot intuitively eat until you are able to hit the 12 principles, or at least to an extent. And one of those is having your hunger and fullness, or two of them technically are having your hunger and fullness cues. And you don't have your hunger and fullness cues for the majority of people after an eating disorder. So they try to go from an eating disorder into that, and they have no idea what to eat. And what we don't realize is that many people that are residing in larger bodies that can be over their set point weight. So let's say they're at a weight that really isn't optimal and they don't feel their best. They're dealing with their own type of disordered eating to a sense. They may not have education. They may not have access to foods that are even options to help them feel well nourished. They may not know when the heck to eat. And so, therefore, they may be dealing with their own lack of knowledge or just challenges that would be a very large barrier to intuitive eating. So we need to meet people where they are at and recognize the bigger picture of the problem. But if someone came to me and they said, I've been just struggling with what to do instead of dieting. I have my hunger and fullness cues. I feel like I know what to do, but I just don't like the place in my body that I'm at. That's someone that could be a great fit for starting to learn intuitive eating, regardless of what the BMI scale says or where they think that their body is in relation to what they think it should be.
Hmm. This is gonna be a big question, but like, let's say someone is at they go to the doctors and then they get weighed and they have their BMI calculated and maybe like they find out, well, maybe it shouldn't be a surprise, but like they find out their BMI is 50.
Mhm.
What would you recommend for that?
Honestly, I am not the expert in the way to work with people that are residing in a body that is larger. And the reason why I say that is not because I would not, but because there's a lot of steps that then you should walk that person through, in my opinion. So, what I would ideally want them to be able to do is to get all of their labs done and see what are their labs at. Because if they don't have any problems in their labs, which I have literally seen this before. I have seen a man that was like 20 years old, I believe. He was in a BMI, I think that was like 50. I mean, he was literally like, I think 500 pounds or something,
Mm.
and like maybe 6 foot. So he was residing in a body that was much larger. All of his labs were perfect. And in my opinion, he was dealing with an eating disorder. I mean, he was barely eating, and it was so sad, and that's where you know something else is going on. And we're not getting the full picture of the scenario, but also all of the discrimination that that poor man is dealing with. And yet he has better labs than like half the freaking population. So it's just crazy how that stuff happens. But going back to this scenario, yeah, you would want them to get their labs tested. And then from there, I think is more where you should take action. And ideally, you would put that person with a practitioner that truly understands how to work with someone in a way that is still non-diet while educating them in the way that they need to be educated, um, addressing any type of barriers that they're experiencing in their life to allow them to incorporate foods, movement, whatever it is, to help them feel their best if they are above that set point weight, like we mentioned. And there are some really wonderful people out there, from dietitians to therapists to even people that work specifically in the obesity field, although I don't really love that term, but still, we'll just use that for what they specifically call it, that can help to create a change that feels beneficial rather than just so diet culture-y and kind of toxic to that person.
Yeah. That was a very well, as I was listening to you, like, talk about that, little scenario, it sounded like a the way you're explaining it is like a very dietetic answer. Check the bloods, and then, like, refer or, like, check out other, like, multidisciplinary things. Yeah, I just felt like, working with another dietitian. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, it's
yeah, that's so amazing. Thank you so much, Mallory, for just coming along, and you're just like a wealth of knowledge, and especially for someone who struggled with orthorexia, because I'm sure the levels are much higher than what's like put on the internet or what
Mhm.
research shows, because also it's like a thing people don't really talk about unless people really delve deep into, like, oh, what are you having for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or are you eating out with friends? Like, it's not something people would say, like, in a survey. Ah, I have this. I'm struggling with orthorexia. So yeah, it's amazing. And if people want to work with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram at Mallory J Page, and that's my same username on TikTok. I used to be on YouTube, as you said. I am on a hiatus, sadly, because I am podcasting now. So my podcast name is Seems Like Diet Culture. And Instagram is kind of a hub to finding all of this stuff, including my program. So I do a program called Live Unrestricted, where I work with women that are struggling with their relationship to food and are kind of caught in that in between state, more like I was saying with myself, maybe you're not at your worst phase, maybe you're atypical, but you're not at the best phase. So those are the women that I work with, and there's tons of information on that program on my site, along with a free training that I have on food freedom and improving your body image if you can't afford that level of support.
Hmm. And I'm gonna be linking all of those in the link in the description of this podcast. And Mallory, um, so there's this tradition that I do in my podcast with recently. I just started it recently. Past two guests is that at the end of every guest podcast, the previous person, the previous guest, would give a question for the next guest, which is you. And the last person, her name is Talida, actually. She's the fertility awareness, she's a fertility awareness educator, raising awareness about hormones and dieting and thyroid, all that stuff. She's asking you if you could pick one thing that has been most life changing for you, what would it be?
I feel like there's the cliche answer because everything that we talked about, that I wouldn't be living the life that I am right now without having my eating disorder, funny enough, because I wouldn't have
Mm.
gone into dietetics. I wouldn't have ended up working with this population. I would have never been in the space that I am. And I do truly believe that this is my purpose. So, although my eating disorder was challenging in so many ways, it also did change my life. And I also don't know if I ever would have really worked through the traumas and the limiting beliefs and my mental health challenges to the same extent if there wasn't that physically presenting component that made me have to turn inward and figure out what the heck was going on. So I do feel like that's somewhat of a cliche answer with everything that we talked about, but I also feel like I would be remiss not to utilize that.
That's a really, really good question. A really good answer, I mean. And it seems like you're just saying, okay, eating disorder, you're gone now. But thank you, by the way, for you're just like throwing away and then like taking what you really got from it. That's
Yeah.
amazing, Mallory. Well,
Thank you.
thank you so much for coming to this podcast. And like once again, just like I'll be linking the links Mallory mentioned to where to find her in the description of this podcast. Struggling with binge eating? Gain access to my exclusive, self-paced binge eating freedom course found in the link in the description of this podcast. My course is everything I wish I knew when I struggled with binge eating, but it's all wrapped up into one easy to understand platform. You'll finally learn how to put an end to binge eating and put an end to food dictating everything you do, controlling your life. Access it now in the link in the description of this podcast.